The ideogram for Dumai 1, Changxiang, can be translated as increasing strength, long and strong, supreme strength, or prolonged rigidity, as well as other things like freshwater turtle. Remember that the turtle is a very yin animal, very slow and hidden under its shell. In Chinese tradition, this rather black turtle, which color is related to the north and to water, represents something extremely yin. Dumai 1 point intersects with kidney and gallbladder meridians. Remember that the latter circles the anus. It is also a sea of the marrow's point. Remember that Dumai connects with the brain, although we're not going to talk about this aspect in this audio. If you look at the clinical indications, going from top to bottom, you'll find excess symptoms in the vertex and in the head. There are also many ocular symptoms. Remember also that the Dumai meridian crosses stomach 1 and bladder 1 acupoints. Well, therefore it makes perfect sense that it would have ocular symptoms. Going downwards, we have heart symptoms, and remember there is an internal branch of the Dumai internal path of Dumai that crosses it. Descending further, the rest of the symptoms affect the spine, as, for instance, single point for spinal and dorsal stiffness, back tenderness, vertebral pain radiating to the hip. This is interesting because I said that Dumai crossed with gallbladder, and such radiation to the hip is typical of Shaoyang. At this point, there are also symptoms in the anterior part of the body. Let's not forget that the posterior meridians also act on the anterior part, such as watery cold damp diarrhea. Note that this is a yin diarrhea due to a lack of yang. And further down still we have symptoms in the coccyx and in the anus. It is a master point of the anus. Symptoms such as hemorrhoids or anal fistula. And if we still continue down later, we find symptoms in the genitals, especially in male, lack of erection, impotence, semen loss, premature ejaculation, or tiredness after ejaculation. Now let's go back to the ideogram. Increasing strength, long and strong, supreme strength, prolonged rigidity. Well, we can think of the spine with the Dumai in void, in which the spine tends to curve. Remember those adolescents who do not raise their heads, as I'd said before. But with this definition, we can also think about the power of the erectile member. In other words, as if the Dumai 1 point had a bidirectional action, both forwards in relation to the penis and also upwards in relation to the spine, giving strength to both. Recently, I have also related that in traditional cultures, it is quite often to find phallic symbols or figures with erect phalluses. Of course, they may allude to reproduction, but also this implies the notion of creation and, in symbolic language, even transcendence, because the phallus, a male yang symbol, would represent an aspiration towards heaven. And this is interesting again, because if you go to see the characteristics, you'll find that Dumai 1 is also the starting point of the longitudinal luo. In fact, there are only two extraordinary vessels that have luo channels, which are Dumai and Renmai. And here now, the longitudinal luo of Dumai 1, look at the image, ascends paravertebrally to the head and makes contact with the upper part. And for acupuncturists, that is contacting heaven. So, on one hand, we find these phallic images as a symbol of spirituality and transcendence in the most young meridian, the immaterial one, whose law, which is the relationship vessel, contacts the individual with the superior, that is, with the transcendent. Now let's go again through the clinical indications, and downwards we find symptoms of the deficiency type in the legs. And finally, under the line, you'll find the general symptoms: fear of fatigue, convulsions due to cold or absolute cold, among others. I'm not going to explain here the psychic resonances of Dumite nor the clinical examples of it, because you have seen them in the corresponding YouTube video. Now please keep an eye to the actions of the point. In Anglo-Saxon texts, I found that they attribute to DM1 the ability to benefit the two yin below. They also affirm that it is the master point of the anus and that it eliminates heat dampness. I'd like to comment on the latter because, in fact, it does seem to eliminate heat damp, for example, diarrhea with mucus and blood. But it could also be interpreted that the bleeding is due to a Qi deficiency, which cannot contain the blood within the vessels. And although the mucus indicates dampness, this can also be due to a yang deficiency not mobilizing enough the yin, and therefore generating dampness. In relation to DM1 actions, beyond the Anglo-Saxon authors, Sully de Morant says that DM1 is a master point of deficiencies and bedridden. Indeed, we see that it treats fear of fatigue. Therefore, in its pathology, there is a general weakness in Dumai. Are there other symptoms of dampness? Well, yes, hemorrhoids, which in fact is a local symptom. So we can think that if DM1 is a point that stimulates the Qi circulation from the origin of the meridian, were it the case that the Qi were not propelled upwards, consequently it should remain accumulated in the local area. All Qi congestions stagnate the circulations of the Jingye, the liquids, causing dampness. But they all have the tendency to generate heat. So, in other words, we could also interpret it that here below the symptoms are really heat damped and are generated by the Qi that does not move. But in my opinion, in the rest, the heat does not seem to predominate. On the contrary, we have cold seizures or absolute cold. So, if we thought that this point, which benefits the two lower yin, which is the master point of the anus, is also a point that mobilizes the yang of Dumai, we would understand that dynamics that explain most of the symptoms with a single gesture. That is, it both eliminates the heat humidity below, retained by a lack of mobilization, and also, higher up, it would clear the hidden dampness patterns that might obey of a yang qi that does not manage to ascend. I follow the case of diarrhea with mucus and blood, but above we also find sinusitis, which could obey to the same mechanism. So it seems to me that instead of memorizing a myriad of unconnected symptoms and even several independent actions, it would be more reasonable to think that the multiplicity of clinical indications of an acupoint obey ultimately from a dynamic that does not unfold. But well, we are not yet done. The action of Dumai seems even more subtly rich and complex to me. We also see in its actions that it calms the Shen. But the Shen can be calmed in very many ways. Is it a strongly agitated Shen, or is it rather a restlessness due to a yin lack? Let's see the clinical indications. it says increased emotion, fear. French authors say other things about the DM1's actions. Jean-Marc Espy states that DM1 is the creative point of DM. That is, that one that stimulates the proper functions of the meridian. I'm not going to explain the psychological derivatives of this archetypal function, which relates DM to the father, because they have been explained in the YouTube video. But Espy adds that DM1 treats DM weakness, and that makes perfect sense. If I were to resume the actions of DM, I would say that it favors the routing of the DM channel in the yin. Let's remember that one of the possible translations of its main ideogram was freshwater turtle. So we can think that DM, a yang meridian, being well rooted in the yin, allows the individual to feel grounded. And so the moment that you're well rooted, you stop being afraid. Therefore, of course, it calms the Shen. But DM1 does not calm the Shen of someone who's angry. It rather calms restlessness and fear because it gives the person a solid and deep grounding in the yin. Jean-Marc Espy also states that this point governs DM as a structure where, according to his own words, the yang of life is attached, both in the creation and in the constant recreation of a being. So the person can lean both physically and psychologically on a strong and solid back. On the other hand, we have seen that DM1 is also the starting point of the longitudinal luo. According to Espy, this would express the yang modes of contact with the outside through the spine, the head, and the psyche. I would resume this point dynamics by saying that it roots the DM, as if the tree that grows upwards needed to develop deep roots to make the sap ascend, a sap whose nutrition is here expressed by the freshwater turtle image. So, this nutrition from the yin of the earth is what allows the upward unfolding of the yang actions expressed by this meridian. And now, please have a look to the secondary ideograms, which seem to make a lot more sense. I will only comment on a few. Chi crack, yin crack, going to the top for an audience with the sovereign of heaven, remember the longitudinal luo, the bottom transported to the top, and yin transported to the chest. Let us remember the symptoms arrhythmia and cardialgia. Yes, of course, if DM is well established, it gives peace of mind to the heart. I think that all this makes much more sense than just trying to remember any acupoint's clinical indications. Because this is what interests me, to understand who might be the candidate patient to apply DM1 on them. Finally, a practical comment about the puncture technique. I use a 1.5 Kun needle because I have to reach the front of the spine, and if it's more comfortable for me to manipulate this needle. I do not like the patient lying on their tummy nor on their force. The first position makes it difficult to access the deep zone that I have to reach, and I find the second one humiliating. My option is to place the patient in lateral decubitus and in the fetal position, facing me. I approach from the front of the patient with a latex glove on my left hand, with which I can separate the buttocks a little bit if necessary. And from above, I see the area of the point without entering the privacy of the patient. Not only does my wrist work freely, in a comfortable and natural position, But it also seems to me the most convenient approach, both for me and the patient, whose waist I then cover with a sheet.